The emergency room felt like a world suspended between hope and despair, bathed in harsh fluorescent light and redolent with the scent of bleach and stale uncertainty. I slid into the hard plastic chair beside Toby's bed, my knees complaining at the sudden bend, and stared down at my son's small frame. He lay half-submerged in crisp white sheets, one arm bent at the elbow in a grotesque twist no parent should ever witness. His lips trembled as he fought tears, but he refused to let them fall. I reached out, smoothing damp curls from his forehead, and tried to summon the calm voice I would need. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I drew it out with trembling fingers. Camille's name glowed on the screen like a beacon I'd long relied on. I tapped it, hesitated, then typed, "Toby is hurt. He needs you." I hit send and pressed the phone against my chest, waiting. My heart thundered in my ears, each beat a reminder of how painfully fragile this moment was. When her reply finally arrived, it stabbed me sharper than any physical blow. "We're busy with Margaret's promotion dinner. Can't you handle it yourself?" He's probably just being dramatic again. I stared at the message until the words burned themselves into my skull. A quiet click sounded in my mind, a door closing, a lock snapping shut on years of denial. I looked back at Toby, at the bravery etched into his small, pale face, and felt something irrevocably shift inside me. I bent down and pressed a kiss to his temple, trying to convey everything I felt: sorrow, fierce protectiveness, and a fierce promise that he was not alone. "You're the bravest kid I know," I whispered. He gave the slightest nod, trusting me to carry us through this. Without another thought, I opened the banking app and watched our lives flash before me in numbers and balances. The mortgage balance loomed large, its automatic debit scheduled in days. The auto loan statement glared with another interest charge. The utility account showed overdue notices in bold red type. My thumb hovered over each link before I tapped into the mortgage portal and canceled the upcoming payment. Then I moved to the auto lender and disabled that debit. Finally, I reversed the utility payment, confirming each cancellation with a quiet resolve. As each confirmation chime sounded, I felt a fierce liberation mingle with the bitter sting of rejection. No longer would I fund a family that refused to recognize my contributions. No longer would I be the unseen provider. Toby squeezed my hand, his tiny fingers curling around mine, and I let myself absorb the gravity of what I'd done. The app slipped into my pocket, and I straightened, brushing back hair damp with sweat. I looked at Toby's face, fearful, but steady, and knew we had taken our first step towards something new. The nurse approached with a clipboard, her expression professionally calm. She explained we needed fresh x-rays, an orthopedic consult, and then the careful resetting of the bone before applying a cast. I listened intently, memorizing every instruction as if my son's healing depended on it, because it did. Toby peered up at me with wide eyes and asked softly, "Will it hurt, Dad?" I knelt beside him and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "It might be a little uncomfortable," I said, "but I'll be right here holding your hand. And afterward, we'll celebrate with ice cream and Grandma Sharon's spaghetti." He managed a weary smile, that flicker of hope shining in his chestnut eyes, and I felt the fierce surge of a parent's determination swell within me. I guided him into a wheelchair for the imaging room, each push of the chair a testament to our new resolve. Camille's absence echoed through the corridor, but instead of hollow pain, it fueled the fierce protectiveness I felt for Toby. I would shield him from every slight and every careless word. He deserved a champion. When the doctor finally called my name, I scooped Toby into my arms and carried him back to his bed, feeling the weight of our decision press on my chest. The sterile white walls blurred around me as I focused solely on the even rise and fall of Toby's breathing. Camille had failed us both, but we would no longer fail ourselves. This fracture, painful as it was, had liberated me from the shackles of a relationship that never truly saw or valued us. By the time the cast was applied and Toby drifted into a medicine-induced sleep, I was alone in the waiting room, hollow chairs stretching out like empty promises. I sank into one and closed my eyes, letting the tension uncoil from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt the sweet release of peace. I had broken the chains of obligation and built a foundation on love and respect instead. I looked around at the sterile walls, feeling courage bloom where fear had taken root. In that quiet moment, I vowed to break free from burdens that never belonged to us. Toby's breath was steady, and I felt the weight lift from my chest. We would build our own family on truth and love. I remembered the first time I walked into Camille's childhood home, a place that always felt to me like a museum dedicated entirely to her sister Margaret. Sunlight filtered through sheer curtains and illuminated framed photographs lining the walls. Margaret at 6, beaming under a balloon arch. Margaret at 12, clutching a spelling bee trophy. Margaret at 22, seated at a grand piano, poised and perfect. Every image captured her achievements, her milestones, her celebrated moments, and somewhere among those red velvet frames, I searched for us. But there was nothing. No snapshot of Camille and me on our wedding day, grinning with hopeful faces. No picture of Toby toddling across a birthday cake table. Not a single memento to acknowledge the life we had built together, right there in the same house that bore witness to every single celebration of Margaret's making. That day, the air smelled faintly of lilies and fresh paint, as if Camille's mother expected a grand unveiling. I hovered in the hallway, helping her arrange chairs for another event they'd planned in Margaret's honor. This time, a themed brunch to commemorate her new corporate title. Camille flitted from side to side, her movements choreographed with practiced grace. "Can you help with the chairs, Isaac?" she called, her voice lilting above the murmur of relatives bustling in the adjacent room. I nodded and carried a stack of folding chairs into place along the wall, setting each one in perfect alignment. Of course I helped. Of course I did every little thing she asked, because I believed that this was the right thing to do, the supportive role I had signed up for when I said I do. But as I worked, something in me had already begun to sour. I felt like a stagehand in a play where I wasn't allowed to step into the light. My reflections twisted in the polished hardwood floors, a man arranging furniture in someone else's story. My name had become a whisper, spoken only when someone needed a favor. I looked up at a sprawling family portrait, Margaret at the center, flanked by proud parents and an array of well-coiffed siblings. The photographer had captured their smiles at just the right moment. But as I gazed at the picture, I saw only the outline of my own absence. A soft pang twisted through my chest. Camille emerged from the living room carrying a tray of teacups, her eyes bright with excitement. "Perfect, Isaac. You're a lifesaver," she said, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her touch was light, but I could feel the weight of her expectation pressing down. I forced a smile, arranging the final chair and straightening its backrest until it was immaculate. I stepped back and surveyed my handiwork, feeling a hollow ache settle at my core. We were the only couple in the room not represented on those walls. Our family existed only in the future tense, never in the visual history that this house guarded so jealously. In that moment, I realized how much I had sacrificed, my sense of belonging, my quiet pride in being Camille's partner, my hope that one day our milestones would matter as much as Margaret's. Instead, I had become invisible, an accessory to her ambition, a resource to be tapped when convenient. I recalled the countless times I had poured myself into her dreams, late nights proofreading presentations, weekend hours spent setting up banquet halls, weekends vacationing at the edges of her grand plans. And each time, I believed I was building something meaningful together. But here, in her childhood home, the omission of any trace of our life was a cruel declaration. You do not belong. I caught my reflection in a brass-framed mirror at the end of the hallway. There I was, the man Camille introduced as her husband, standing alone among strangers who slid past me without a glance. My shoulders felt heavy, burdened by the years of quiet compliance. I wanted to speak up, to say something that would startle them into noticing me, but the words caught in my throat. How do you demand recognition when you've been trained to remain unseen? My throat tightened as I remembered Toby's hopeful question earlier that week. "Dad, why don't we have pictures on the wall at Grandma's house?" I had shrugged and murmured something about space, but his small voice had lingered in my mind. Space for what? For whom? A sudden stillness settled over me, and I realized that this bruise inside was deepening. It wasn't just hurt or disappointment. It was the slow erosion of a man's identity under the weight of neglect. I felt anger twist beneath the hurt, cold and precise, whispering that I deserved better than this role as a silent sponsor. I straightened my spine and left the chairs behind, walking toward the front door as the din of the brunch preparations rose behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The pictures on the wall had said everything already. Outside, the afternoon sun felt harsh on my face, but the air tasted cleaner than it had inside. I breathed deeply and felt my chest expand. In that moment, I made a choice. I would no longer stand in the background of a life that refused to include me. I would claim my space, my worth, and my right to be seen first by myself, then by the world. Turning away from the house that housed every memory of Margaret's ascendancy, I walked to my car with deliberate steps. Inside, I let out a slow breath, tasting the promise of the first breath of freedom. And I knew that from this day forward, I would be in the pictures of my own life. I stood behind the velvet rope in the cavernous ballroom, the soft glow of chandeliers casting a warm halo over faces that sparkled with admiration. Crystal glasses clinked in polite toasts, and laughter rippled like silk. I watched Camille drift through the crowd, her heels clicking confidently on polished marble as she accepted congratulations for Margaret's exceptional rise. The words pricked me, exceptional rise, as though none of this would exist without her family's relentless drive. I felt the weight of every euro I'd lent to cover the dinner's extravagant catering, every cent borrowed from our savings, until the bonus cleared. The bonus that never came. Victor raised his glass with a flourish, the audience leaning in for his pronouncement. To Margaret, a trailblazer whose perseverance and vision have brought her to this milestone. Applause thundered around me, and Margaret herself beamed, overjoyed to be the center of such adulation. Rowan, her younger brother, dabbed at tears of pride as he watched his sister's moment. Across the room, Camille flashed me a brief smile, one that dissolved in an instant as she turned her attention back to Margaret's admirers. It was like watching a photo snapped mid-movement. My presence acknowledged only in passing, then forgotten. I raised my camera reflexively, framing Margaret's triumphant expression as Victor draped a bouquet of orchids around her shoulders. Through the viewfinder, the scene looked perfect. A daughter honored by parents, siblings beaming, a woman poised to conquer the world. I snapped several shots, each click echoing in my chest like a hollow beat. My role was clear. I was the photographer, the financier, the ever-present observer. But I wasn't family. Not really. I swallowed hard and lowered the camera, pressing my back against the far wall to stay out of the way. My mind drifted to Toby, safe at home with Grandma Sharon, blissfully unaware of this display. He would never ask for me to stand on a stage like this. He just wanted to be seen by the people who loved him. Here, no one had asked after our son or checked if he knew why his father was absent from his own son's life tonight. No one asked where Toby was recovering. No soft whisper that his arm was still in a splint. I felt a chill despite the warmth of the room, realizing that belonging required more than financial investment. It required a shared heartbeat. I moved toward the refreshments table to hide the trimmer in my hands. Platters of smoked salmon and artisanal cheeses gleamed under the lights. As I poured a glass of water, a guest brushed past me, murmuring, "How lucky Camille is to have you here supporting her family." Lucky. The word tasted like ash. I closed my eyes for a moment and remembered the months I spent scraping together funds, juggling extra shifts to keep up with their expectations. I had believed these sacrifices would weave me into the fabric of the family, thread by invisible thread. Instead, I remained the outsider, the safety net snapped taut beneath them. Camille reappeared, her laughter rising above the hum of voices as she accepted another gift, an ornate vase emblazoned with the company logo. She caught my eye and mouthed, "Everything's perfect." I lifted my brow. "Perfect for whom?" I asked softly. Her smile faltered for an instant, but she recovered, tilting her head. "Don't be so dramatic," she whispered. Her tone was gentle but final, like dismissing a child's tantrum. I drew a slow breath and let the water in my glass settle. "It's perfect. If your heart feels empty," I replied, voice low enough that only she could hear. She stared at me, a flash of uncertainty crossing her features before she turned away. In that pivot, I saw the truth crystallize. She would never understand. The applause rose again, and I placed the glass on the table with a soft clink. I straightened my shoulders and stepped back into the currents of celebration, shoulders squared as though I owned every inch of space. I may have funded their indulgence, but I would no longer subsidize my own erasure. Tonight, I was the man who paid for a dinner no one truly celebrated, and the family I'd bought entry into still refused to let me in. I lifted my head and resolved that from this moment forward, my loyalty belonged only where love was reciprocated, first and foremost, to my son. That night, after the last guest had filtered out and the echoes of laughter dissolved into distant memory, I found myself sitting on the edge of our bed, Toby's school bag resting against my leg like a silent ally. The hallway beyond our bedroom door was dark, the house unnaturally still. I pressed my palm to the cool metal zipper of the bag and felt the weight of every unopened photograph he had tucked inside. Family vacations, Halloween costumes, birthday parties, none of which included Camille. His world had begun to revolve around her family entirely, while he and I became incidental figures in someone else's story. I reached inside the bag and pulled out his half-finished family tree project, the one he had brought home that evening. He listed me first, in bold, careful letters, beneath our names, Sharon and Henry. Then he left Camille's branch blank. Under Mom, he drew an empty box that seemed to pulse with quiet accusation. My throat tightened as I read his pencil-scrawled note. Does not know me well. My heart bruised at the candor, yet in that moment I realized how freeing his honesty was. There was no shame in acknowledging the absence of love. There was only truth. I slipped off my wedding ring and placed it on the bedside table, its gold band catching the edge of a stray beam of moonlight. It felt heavy, foreign, no longer the symbol of unity and promise I had believed it to be. I touched it gently and remembered the vows I had whispered on our wedding day, to love, to honor, to cherish. I had kept my word, in actions and in silence, funding dreams and wiping tears. But somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that marriage was a partnership, not indentured servitude. I drew in a breath, the air tasting of late-night stillness and decision. I stood and walked across the room to the dresser, where our photo frames perched like sentinels. One frame held an engagement photo, Camille smiling brightly, me standing beside her, proud and hopeful. Another held a snapshot of our first Christmas together, Toby nestled between us, oblivious to the heartbreak that quietly festered. I took each frame in turn, feeling the weight of my complicity in preserving a story that no longer served us. I set them all face down on the dresser, a silent judgment. These images belonged to a past that had betrayed its promise. Back on the bed, I pressed my forehead to the soft comforter and closed my eyes, letting the tears come. They were not loud or violent. They were quiet and deliberate, each one washing away a shard of denial. I allowed myself to feel the full breadth of sorrow, anger, and relief that had built up over years. My marriage had been a ledger of sacrifices unreciprocated, of moments unseen and unacknowledged. And so, in the darkness, I grieved that loss, and simultaneously, I mourned the man I had been, silent, compliant, invisible. When the tears slowed, I reached under the pillow and pulled out the stack of credit card statements I had hidden there. I flipped through them, each balance transfer and loan repayment a record of the faith I had placed in her family's promises. With one steady movement, I tore each statement in half, watching the fragments float to the floor. I felt lighter with each page I shattered, as though the act itself was an exorcism of years of resentment. In the small hours, I sat back and watched the pale light of dawn filter through the curtains. I felt the unfamiliar stirrings of hope. I understood, with crystal clarity, that loyalty earned was far more precious than familial obligation. My son deserved to grow in a world where his father stood as an equal partner, not a shadow cast by others. I stood, gathering the torn pieces like broken vows, and carried them to the trash bin. There, I emptied them, granting myself permission to close that chapter. By the time Toby stirred, rubbing crust from his eyes and asking for breakfast, I was already downstairs, humming softly as I measured flour and cracked eggs into the bowl. I mixed the ingredients for pancakes and, without hesitation, added extra blueberries, Toby's favorite. He bounded into the kitchen, still half asleep, and threw his arms around my waist. "Dad," he whispered, "today feels different." I paused, spatula in hand, and met his gaze. "It is, buddy," I said, "because today we start fresh on our own terms." He beamed, and I smiled back, knowing that for the first time in years, I was letting go of the past so that we could step into a future built on truth, dignity, and real love. The doctor's words echoed in the cramped examination room long after he'd left. "It's a clean fracture. He'll need a cast for at least 6 weeks." I nodded, swallowing past the knot in my throat as I knelt beside Toby's bed. His eyes were wide as saucers, rimmed red with pain and fear. He offered me a small, unconvincing smile and asked, "I was brave, right, Dad?" I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and pressed my lips gently to his temple. "The bravest," I whispered, voice thick with pride. Watching the nurse wrap his forearm in the white fiberglass, I felt each layer tighten around his small wrist like the binds I'd allowed around my own life for far too long. Camille didn't show up. Not a call, not a text, not even a "how is he?" I stood in the hallway afterward, leaning against the cool tile wall, trying to steady my breathing. In my hand, I still held the crumpled invitation to Margaret's next family gala, the one Camille had pressed into my palm just days before Toby's accident. The words on the back went unnoticed by her in that moment of crisis. "Your support means everything to us." Everything to them, except to her. My jaw clenched as I crumpled that invitation in my fist, the paper's fibers scratching my palm as if to remind me of promises I would no longer keep. When we reached the parking garage, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of oil and concrete filled my nostrils. I slid Toby into his booster seat, careful not to jostle his injured arm. He leaned against me, and I wrapped my jacket around his shoulders, imagining it as a shield against the world that had abandoned him. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice laced with a brittle hope, "can we go to Grandma Sharon's? She makes real spaghetti." I swallowed hard, feeling the lump in my throat grow. Real. The word landed in my chest like a weight, heavier than any cast. "Yes, son. Every Sunday. From now on." As I drove, I stole glances at Toby in the rearview mirror. His cast gleamed ghost-white against his favorite red t-shirt, and the way he rotated his wrist ever so slightly to look back at me broke something open inside. I remembered the long hours I spent paying for dinners, gifts, and hotel suites that were meant to create a sense of belonging we never felt. I thought of how I justified each bank transfer as an investment in our future together, believing that money could buy acceptance, or at least gratitude. The thought made me bitter, but I pushed it aside, refocusing on the glow in Toby's eyes at the thought of Grandma Sharon's cooking. When we pulled into her driveway, the afternoon sun warmed the front porch, and I breathed in the scent of basil and garlic that drifted through the open window. Sharon flung the door wide and scooped Toby into a hug, her laughter soft and genuine. "Oh, sweet boy, let's get you inside," she cooed, rubbing her cheek against his cast. Henry stood behind her, offering me a sympathetic smile. It was a small sanctuary of warmth and welcome, a stark contrast to the chilly indifference we'd left behind. As I followed them into the kitchen, I realized that this simple act of being seen and cared for, was the love I'd been chasing all along. Inside, the kitchen table was already set, a steaming pot of sauce bubbling on the stove. The sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting a golden haze over the room. I took a seat beside Toby and watched as Sharon ladled pasta onto his plate, sliding a meatball across with the tip of her spoon. Toby's eyes lit up, and he dug in with enthusiasm, sauce splattering the tablecloth in joyful abandon. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to brace for disappointment. Instead, I sat back, letting the aroma of tomatoes and garlic fill my senses, and felt a quiet peace settle in my chest. As we ate, Toby chattered about school, friends, and his upcoming soccer match, oblivious to the fracture that confined him. I joined in, answering his questions and laughing at his jokes, my heart unburdening itself with each smile he offered. Across the table, Sharon met my gaze with a gentle nod, as if acknowledging the unspoken truth between us. Some families are made by blood, but others are built by devotion and kindness. I placed my hand over Toby's and squeezed, vowing silently that I would never let him, or myself, be cast aside again. In that humble kitchen, among the flicker of candlelight and the melody of laughter, I felt the first true taste of belonging. 3 days after we left Grandma Sharon's, the phone rang just as I was tucking Toby into bed, the soft glow of his nightlight casting gentle shadows on his cast. I paused, heart hammering, because every ring lately had felt like a test I hadn't studied for. I glanced at the screen. Rowan Cross. My stomach clenched, but something inside me held steady. I swiped to answer. "Hello." I kept my voice neutral, bracing for whatever plea or accusation might come. "Isaac," Rowan began, voice tight around the words, as though he'd swallowed glass. "It's Victor. His medication refill didn't go through. And there's the car payment. Camille says we're really struggling this month." He exhaled, a soft hiss that carried months of worry and unspoken guilt. I closed my eyes and leaned against the doorframe, remembering the countless transfers I'd authorized when I believed they were a bridge to acceptance. I felt the old urge to solve the problem, to restore the fragile peace, curl in my chest. But it died under the weight of my resolve. "I know," I said carefully, folding my arms. "I've helped for 10 years. I let the sentence hang, waiting for Rowan's response. There was a long silence, as though he was weighing every option on whether to push back. Finally, he said, "Can you help this month?" His tone was a blend of apology and entitlement, like he both hated to ask and felt he had every right. I drew a deep breath. "I'm not your bank anymore." My voice was calm but carried an unmistakable firmness. I pictured the statements I'd torn up, the invitations I'd bunched into fists, the ring I'd set aside, all symbols of my refusal to subsidize their indifference any longer. Rowan's silence crackled through the speaker. "He has a mother," he said quietly, as if reminding me of some invisible rule I'd defied. I almost laughed at the idea that the woman who ignored our son in crisis was somehow entitled to his protection. Not one who shows up, I replied, bitterness threading my words. If she cared, she'd call him. She'd ask how he is. She wouldn't leave him alone in the ER, alone with me. I could almost feel Rowan flinch. He's your son too, he whispered. A fragile accusation, as if he was testing whether the bond between father and son was somehow negotiable. I squeezed my eyes shut, gathering the remnants of my patience. Yes, I said slowly, he's my son. That's exactly why I won't let him grow up thinking that love is something you earn by writing checks. Rowan sighed, the sound of a man crushed by choices he'd made long ago. Camille, he began, but then stopped, as though unsure how to finish the sentence. I remembered the last time I'd called her name, when I'd texted for help in the ER and got back that acidic reply. How her priorities had been skewed so far from the boy with the broken arm. I'm sorry you're struggling, I said, surprising myself with the honesty in my tone. But Toby deserves better than what you and Camille have to offer right now. I waited as if expecting Rowan to refute me, to argue that family meant whatever obligations you imposed on each other. But only silence came, heavy and final. Okay, he said at last, voice hollow. I understand. Then he hung up. I stared at the dark screen, feeling the weight of a door slamming shut. I knew Camille would be next, calling to demand answers. But in that quiet moment, I realized the void on the other end of the line wasn't empty, it was mine. A space carved out by years of self-sacrifice, now echoing with the relief of having stepped away. I tucked my phone into my pocket and opened Toby's door. He lay under his covers, eyes bright and curious. You all right, Dad? He asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I sat on the edge of the bed and lifted the blankets so he could slide his casted arm around my neck. Yeah, buddy, I said softly. I'm better than ever. He smiled and yawned, drifting back toward sleep. I turned out the light and stood in the doorway, watching him breathe, feeling the hush of contentment settle over me. No frantic calls, no urgent pleas for money, just the peaceful rhythm of my son's rest. I realized that by blocking numbers and canceling payments, I hadn't created an empty chasm. I'd made room for something truer, something stronger than obligation. In the quiet of the hallway, I felt a presence, steady and unwavering. It was the man I'd begun to become, a father who refused to fund indifference, who guarded his son's heart above all else. And I understood that sometimes peace isn't found in giving. It's found in reclaiming what you once surrendered. As I closed the door behind me, I felt an unexpected calm. The void on the other end of the line wasn't a loss. It was freedom. My phone buzzed in my pocket just as I was stacking plates in the sink, the clatter of ceramic against metal echoing through the quiet apartment. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, my muscles still sore from lugging boxes at the moving company earlier that day. 6 months had passed, but the precision of that first switch, from provider to protector, remained vivid in my mind. I swiped the screen and saw Margaret Cross, lighting up the display. A knot tightened in my chest. Margaret rarely called. She had never needed anything from me directly. I hesitated, then tapped the answer icon. Isaac. Her voice trembled, crisp and composed as ever, but with an undercurrent of something I hadn't heard before, vulnerability. What did you do to Mom and Dad? I leaned back against the counter, arms folded across my chest. I'd rehearsed this answer 100 times in my head. Part of me still expected to feel guilty, to apologize and resume footing their bills. But that part had been laid to rest long ago. I stopped paying their bills, I said evenly. There was a sharp intake of breath on the line. You what? Money felt slippery in my mouth. I ran a hand through my hair. Everything, mortgage, car, utilities, medication, everything goes to you guys now. I'm done funding your life. Silence stretched between us, taut as a wire. I watched the steam rising from the sink's drain, feeling the echo of my words settle in the room. Margaret finally spoke, her voice tight with disbelief. They're your in-laws. I held the phone tighter, my knuckles whitening. They were never my in-laws. They were never anything to me, just people I paid. I saw a flicker of surprise in her reply, as though my words had cut through her expectations like a blade. They think you're punishing them, she said, though it sounded more like an accusation aimed at her own parents than at me. I let out a short laugh, low and mirthless. Punishment? There's no punishment in refusing to be invisible any longer. I'm not punishing anyone. I'm removing myself from the role they cast me in. Margaret hesitated, and in that pause I heard the tremor of truth. She understood how she and her family had treated me and Toby. Maybe she'd even felt culpable. Maybe you should have done it sooner, she said, her tone raw. lacking the polished lilt of those promotion dinners. Her honesty startled me more than her earlier shock. She closed the distance between us in that single phrase, stripping away the entitlement that had once defined every interaction. Maybe I should have, I admitted. The words felt strange, softer, more vulnerable than I was used to. Her breath caught. Dad, Mom, they always said you were generous. I turned off the water and dried my hands, pacing the length of the kitchen. Trudeau Place wasn't big, but it felt huge with all the space I'd carved out by walking away. There's a difference between generosity and being taken for granted, I said. Generosity is a gift. Being taken for granted is a trap. Margaret was silent again. I could almost hear her weighing options, to defend her parents or to acknowledge what I'd endured. Finally, she chose the latter. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't realize how much. Her confession cut through the static of old grievances and opened a door I had sealed shut. For a moment, regret flickered in my chest. I had never wanted to hurt Margaret, only to protect my son and reclaim my life. It's okay, I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. What matters is that you know now. Margaret's voice cracked. I'm sorry. For everything. I paused, listening to the tremor in her tone. Thank you, I said softly. That means more than you know. She exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping. I guess this makes us even more complicated than I thought. Complicated families are still families, I replied, surprising myself by extending an olive branch. If you want to help, start by asking how Toby is, not by asking your parents to call the plumber. She chuckled, a small sound of relief. He's doing great, she said, voice brightening. His arm's healed, and he's back to soccer practice. I smiled, picturing my son charging down the field, the wind in his hair, free of fractures and family drama. That's good to hear. Margaret hesitated, then said, would it be okay if I visited? With Dad and Mom? I think they'd like to see Toby. My chest tightened. I remembered standing next to Camille in the ER, the cold detachment with which her family had treated my panic. I remembered the wall of photos devoid of our faces, the dinners that never felt like celebrations for all involved. But I also remembered Margaret's voice now, soft and uncertain, extending a hand toward reconnection. I glanced at the framed drawing on my fridge, Toby's family tree, Sharon and Henry in bold letters, Camille's branch empty. No, I thought. I didn't want to let her parents near us yet. Maybe someday, but not now. I squared my shoulders and exhaled. I'm not ready for that, I said firmly. Maybe another time. Margaret sighed, gentle disappointment in her tone. I understand. Thank you, I said again, though this time it felt hollow. Guilt fluttered in my chest before I swallowed it down. I had fought too hard to gain this peace to surrender it now. There's something else, she began, voice smaller. When you left, things got hard for them. They didn't know how to cope. I felt my resolve waver, the old impulse to rescue them flickering. But I shook my head. They'll figure it out, I said. I did. We all did. Margaret was quiet, and I sensed her searching for words. Finally, she said, take care of yourself, Isaac. I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me. You too, Margaret. We hung up, and I set the phone on the counter, staring at it as though it held all the remnants of my past life. I pressed my hands to my temples, exhaling a long breath. The silence that filled the apartment wasn't lonely, eh? It was the promise of a new space carved from old ties, a space I would guard with every ounce of my strength. I turned toward the living room, where the afternoon light spilled across the coffee table cluttered with Lego bricks and soccer programs. In the glow, I saw something clear. Family wasn't defined by obligation or expectation. It was defined by the choice to be present, to honor one another's worth. Margaret's call had rattled the walls of my solitude, but it hadn't toppled the fortress I'd built around my son and me. I picked up my camera, the one I'd used to chronicle countless dinners and celebrations I'd never truly been part of, and set it aside. The lens pointed outward, but I wanted to focus inward now, on healing, on creating new memories with Toby in a home that felt like ours. I exhaled, soft and steady, and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the city hummed with life. People going about their routines, unaware of the quiet revolutions happening inside this small apartment. I placed my hand on the glass and closed my eyes, feeling the warmth of resilience bloom in my chest. Margaret had asked what I did to her parents. I had stopped paying their bills, but in doing so, I had also freed myself from a role that never served me. I had reclaimed my story. And as I stood there, I realized that the only true question was this: what would I do with my freedom now? I opened my eyes and smiled, ready to find out. I found Toby perched at the kitchen table early that Saturday morning, sunlight filtering through the window and golden shafts that danced across his new sketchbook. He sat there in his red t-shirt, his cast long gone, replaced by a faint gray outline that curved around his wrist like a whisper of the past, and I could almost see the excitement crackling in his eyes. "Dad, look," he said, turning the book toward me. His family tree filled the page, branches stretching outward from his name in the center, each limb labeled in his careful handwriting. Sharon and Henry's names were written large and firm, their words underlined twice. Under Mom, there was simply an empty box. Beside it, he typed in tiny letters, "Does not love me well." I settled into the chair beside him, my heart tightening at the honesty that only a child could muster, and that only a neglected soul could summon strength to admit. He'd erased and redrawn, tweaking branch angles until they looked just right, and I could tell he'd wrestled with the decision to leave that space blank. "Are you sure?" I asked in a soft voice. The years of second-guessing my own choices rose to my throat, tempting me to talk him out of another stark truth. But I saw the calm certainty in his gaze. "I want people in my story who show up," he replied, voice firm and free of doubt. The conviction in his small frame stunned me. A boy who had just weathered a broken arm and family rifts now understood the power of selecting the company we keep. I leaned forward, studying the intricate network of pencil lines. Beneath grandparents, he'd drawn an arching branch and written both sets of grandparents, Sharon and Henry on one side. He'd hesitantly sketched Camille's parents on the other, only to cross their names out. The erasure smudges left faint shadows of letters that read Victor and Maureen Cross. He'd even scribbled a small apology next to the smudge, maybe later. His vulnerability seared me, revealing how deep his desire for genuine connection ran. Yet he knew better than to assume affection where it didn't exist. When I cupped his shoulder, he didn't flinch. He slid the sketchbook closed and met my eyes. "Dad," he said, voice low and measured, "this is who I am. The people who love me and I love back. That's my family." He tilted his head, as if waiting for me to confirm his revelation with the reverence it deserved. I swallowed, the lump in my throat threatening to spill emotion I wasn't ready to name. "You're right, bud," I said, reaching out to tap the drawn heart he'd placed beside his name. "This is your family tree, and you get to choose who grows in it." He smiled, and I saw the weight in his shoulders ease, replaced by a quiet pride that only truth can inspire. "Can we keep this?" he asked. "I want to remember." I hesitated for a beat, then slipped my phone from my pocket and turned on the camera. His grin widened as I snapped a photo, the flash capturing the soft morning light and the earnest glow in his eyes. "This goes in my gallery," I promised. "Not to share with everyone, just for us. To remember what really matters." He nodded, closing the book with a gentle pat, and then slid from the chair to hug my waist. "Thanks, Dad." In that embrace, I felt more connected to him than ever before. We'd weathered hospital lights and broken bones and family betrayals, and yet here we were, two souls tethered by love stronger than any contract. He continued to chatter about how he might color the branches, maybe give Grandma Sharon's name a gold star, maybe draw a soccer ball beside his own. I listened, marveling at the way his imagination infused everyday objects with significance. He was learning how to define his identity, branch by branch, and I was honored to guide him through this process. Later, I framed a small reproduction of his drawing on our living room wall, a place of honor next to a photograph of Toby on his first day back at school after the cast came off. The framed family tree hung above our couch, a testament to honesty and to the power of love earned rather than assumed. Each evening as I settled in with a book or tuned the TV to his favorite game show, I caught sight of those bold pencil marks and remembered the lesson he'd taught me, that belonging is a choice, not an obligation. That afternoon, we took the drawing down and spread out colored pencils on the dining table. Together, we added details, a bright flower beside Sharon's name, a stack of books beside Henry's, and a small trophy next to Toby's own branch for his bravery. We left the spot for Camille blank, but I sensed a possibility shimmering in the empty space, an invitation for growth if and when real affection filled it. Toby sketched a tiny welcome banner above his tree, and I felt the gentle pull of forgiveness in that tender act. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, washing the room in a soft orange glow, I realized that our home was becoming its own sanctuary, a place where we defined family by presence and devotion. I ruffled Toby's hair and smiled at the drawing. That's our family, I said, rooted in love, watered by truth. He beamed up at me, and I knew that no matter what storms lay ahead, we would stand firm together. Because in the end, legacy isn't built on convenience or name alone. It's built on the choices we make to be there for one another, branch by branch, heartbeat by heartbeat. It took 4 weeks before Camille's name appeared on my phone again, and by then the novelty of my newfound peace had settled into something deeper, steady as the rhythm of Toby's breathing beside me as he slept. I was reading late that evening, my office lamp casting a soft pool of light over open books and scattered papers, when the call came through. I paused, surprised by a ripple of apprehension that had nothing to do with money. I knew exactly what she would say, and yet my heart skipped as I tapped the green icon. Isaac, Camille began, voice tight with forced calm. She sounded as if she were standing in the garage, the overhead door half closed, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Can you explain why the insurance is canceled? Her words were clipped, businesslike, masking panic beneath. My chest tightened. Insurance was one thing, but I'd already shifted utilities and loans. I steadied my voice. The auto debit didn't go through, I said. I turned off all the payments. A sharp intake of breath traveled across the line. The faint hiss of her exasperation curled around each syllable. You stopped all of it? But how are we supposed to manage the mortgage payment? The electricity bill? The car insurance? She listed them like accusations. I could almost see her wiping sweat from her brow as she paced the kitchen floor. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I'm not your financial spine anymore, I replied evenly, feeling the power in those words. They were simple but final, like a verdict rendered and delivered. Camille's next breath was a brittle attempt at composure. You're punishing me for one dinner? She demanded. My pulse quickened, memory unfurling like a dark tide. The bleach walls of that ER, Toby's frightened eyes, the text that had glowed like acid on my screen, were busy with Margaret's promotion dinner. Can't you handle it yourself? I pressed my fingertips to my temple as though trying to quell a storm. One dinner? I asked softly, letting incredulity edge my words. Try 8 years of skipped birthdays, missed school plays, and silence when our son cried out for his mother. Silence answered me, long and ragged, until Camille's voice returned, trembling. I'm sorry, she began, tentative. I didn't know. The apology hung in the space between us like a fragile paper boat rocking on a turbulent sea. I closed my eyes, reminding myself that this conversation was not about vengeance, but about boundaries, lines drawn to protect my son and myself from further erosion. I warned you, I said quietly, choosing calm over anger. I told you how many times I carried this family on my back. I told you that money couldn't buy love, but you never listened. I inhaled deeply. I'm not here to apologize for reclaiming my life. Camille's next words crackled with blame. Margaret, my parents, they think you're making us suffer. She paused, then added in a rush, they think you hate us. Her voice cracked on that last word as though it hurt her to say it. I drew a slow breath and imagined Toby lying safe in his bed, years of betrayal behind him, dreaming of spaghetti dinners with grandmother Sharon. That image steadied me. I don't hate anyone, I said carefully. I only learned that love and care have to be given freely, not extracted through financial obligation. I let the silence stretch again, louder than any argument. She must have swallowed hard. If you ever cared about us, she began, but then stopped, as if realizing a confession mid-sentence. If you cared about me, you'd understand how hard things are. I shut my book and rose to pace the hardwood floor. My footsteps were deliberate, echoing in the silence. I understand hardship, I said, voice steady. I get by every month working extra shifts so I can provide for my son and give him a stable home. That's my priority now. Camille's sigh sounded distant, a sound of resignation rather than relief. What am I supposed to do? She whispered, vulnerability bleeding through her frustration. My heart softened at that honesty. 6 months ago, I would have leapt to her side, paid another bill, reassured her that everything would be fine. But I was different now, forged by the realization that my worth did not lie in my bank balance. You figure it out, I said, though my tone was gentler than before. Use the bonus Margaret owes you. Sell the car if you have to. Make your own decisions. A pause, then she said, you don't have to be so cruel. Her words trembled on the cusp of tears. I paused too, letting her feel the weight of my absence. Cruel to free myself from a role I never accepted? I asked quietly. If I'm cruel for reclaiming my dignity, so be it. I heard her inhale sharply, then the click of her inhale. It sounded like defeat. I'll, I'll try, she said, voice small. I swallowed the last echoes of resentment and softened my tone. I hope you do, I said, surprising even myself with the gentleness that slipped through. For Toby's sake. Silence, then a single breath. Okay, Camille said at last. I closed my eyes and offered a silent prayer for her and for her parents, that they might learn what I had learned, that love cannot be bought, and support must flow both ways. Goodbye, Camille, I said. Goodbye, she whispered. I ended the call and set my phone on the desk, pressing my fingertips together as I exhaled. There was a hush in the apartment now, untainted by a dozen half-promises. I returned to my books, but sleep eluded me. My mind replayed every moment of that conversation, tracing the lines I had drawn and the freedom I had claimed. Hours later, dawn's pale light crept through the curtains, and I padded down the hallway to Toby's room. He was still asleep, limbs splayed across the bed, breathing easy. I sat on the edge of the mattress and brushed his hair back from his forehead. His quiet resilience. His empty box, now framed by strength, not pain, was all the answer I needed. I stood and turned toward the window, watching the sky shift from indigo to rose. Camille's call had been what I expected, yet it had still rattled me. But as I breathed in the cool morning air, I felt the truth settle in my chest like a promise. I had chosen presence over obligation, love over sacrifice. And in that choice, I had become the man and the father I was always meant to be. 6 months later, the apartment was alive with the clink of toy cars on hardwood floors, the rustle of soccer socks being pulled up, and the steady hum of the small radiator in the corner. I crouched beside the coffee table, sorting through a jumbled mosaic of Legos, red, blue, and yellow bricks forming the unstable foundation of a fortress Toby insisted we build together. He knelt opposite me, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth in intense concentration. His cast was long gone, replaced by a faint gray line tracing the outline of healed bone. But every time he flexed his wrist, I reminded him gently to take care, because I'd learned how fragile a body and a heart could be. The fortress grew brick by brick, and with it a sense of serenity I hadn't known in years, the soft echo of my son's laughter as he tested a ramp, the bright sheen of afternoon light through the window panes, and the solid click of each piece locking into place under our careful hands. When Toby pushed back and declared our masterpiece finished, we stood it on the windowsill for inspection. He grinned up at me, his chestnut eyes shining, and said, "It's perfect, Dad. Just like us." I felt warmth surge through me, the kind that floods a man's chest when he realizes he's built something real and lasting. I ruffled his dark hair, proud of the way he stood tall beside our triumph of plastic bricks. Outside the window, the city skyline loomed indifferent and gray, but here our fortress held back every shadow. "Yeah," I said, voice hushed with gratitude. "Just like us." That evening, after dinner, simple spaghetti and meatballs courtesy of Grandma Sharon, always better than any Michelin-starred recipe, I settled into my own quiet ritual. I pulled Toby's family tree from the wall and studied it under the glow of my desk lamp. The names of Sharon and Henry were now inked in bold permanent marker, surrounded by a halo of stars and hearts that Toby had drawn. Below, the space for Camille remained blank, a silent testament to his choice. And alongside his own name, I'd added my own gentle flourish, a camera, marking my role as chronicler of our new story. I traced the pencil lines with a finger and thought back to the day he first scribbled that empty box. Even then, I'd seen the seeds of resilience in his young heart. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Not a plea or demand, but a simple, "Can we invite Grandma Sharon to Toby's soccer game this Saturday?" My pulse fluttered, caught between old defensiveness and the possibility of cautious reconciliation. I typed back, "Already did, bud," and hit send before I could second-guess myself. I wanted to keep our family small, bounded by the love we knew was real, but I also recognized Margaret's tentative steps toward bridging the divide her family had created. Maybe it was too soon for Camille and her parents, but inviting Grandma Sharon felt right. She'd be the one person in that grandstand who would cheer for Toby the way he deserved, to the sky and back. On Saturday morning, we piled into my beat-up sedan, no longer the least luxury vehicle of our old life, and drove to the community soccer field. The air was crisp with early autumn chill, and I slipped an arm around Toby's shoulder as we walked onto the crisp green turf. His teammates clustered around, oozing adolescent bravado, while parents traded coffee-scented greetings on the sidelines. I set my camera on a tripod at the edge of the field, framing a perfect line of sight down the pitch. As I adjusted the focus, I felt the satisfying click of reclaimed purpose, to capture moments of genuine joy rather than forced celebrations. The whistle blew, shrill and decisive, and the game commenced in a flurry of legs and laughter. Toby darted and dodged, his cast-free arm pumping as he chased the ball with determination that outpaced his opponent's. Every time he scored, he'd glance my way, eyes bright, as if to share the victory. Behind the line of parents, I spotted Grandma Sharon waving a checkered picnic blanket and holding 2 travel mugs. I waved back, heart swelling. Seeing her there, a grandmother who showed up, who made time, who loved him unconditionally, felt like the final piece of a family portrait finally completed. At halftime, I gathered Toby and Sharon beneath a linden tree. He clutched a bottle of water, breathing hard but smiling, and Sharon handed me a thermos of hot tea. "He's doing wonderfully," she said, pride radiating from her voice. I nodded, watching the other players reassemble. I remembered the nights I spent scrambling for funds to pay for hospital stays and dinners Camille's family never acknowledged. Those nights had felt endless, but now they were distant echoes, replaced by quiet afternoons like this one, framed by shared love and mutual respect. As the final whistle blew and the game ended in a celebratory draw, Toby raced toward me, legs kicking up tufts of grass. He flung himself into my arms, breathless with excitement. I scooped him up, spinning him around once before setting him down gently. He pointed toward the stands, where Sharon clapped with genuine delight. I raised my own hands in a triumphant cheer, grinning at the memory of how far we'd come. Walking off the field, Toby chattered about the next game, about practicing free kicks in our backyard, about building another Lego fortress. I listened, each word a brick in the foundation of our shared future. I realized then that home wasn't a physical space, but the presence of someone who sees you, who shows up, who stands by you when the world turns its back. I felt the weight of old burdens lift from my shoulders with every confident step he took. That evening, as we settled back in our living room with popcorn and a movie, I looked around at our modest apartment, its walls lined with Toby's drawings, our framed photos of simple joys, our Lego fortress perched proudly on the windowsill. The air was thick with contentment. The man who once believed that belonging could be bought had finally learned that the only currency that mattered was time, attention, and authenticity. I reached over and squeezed Toby's knee. He looked up at me, eyes heavy with sleep, but bright with happiness. "Do you feel like you belong here now, buddy?" I asked softly. He nodded, snuggling into the couch cushions. "I do, Dad. With you and Grandma Sharon, I'm right where I'm meant to be." I turned my gaze to the window, where the last light of day faded into a tapestry of stars. I felt the familiar ache of gratitude spread through my chest. I had spent a decade trying to belong in a house that never saw me. But here, in this small apartment, I had built a home that didn't need proof, only presence. And in that quiet truth, I had found everything I'd ever been looking for.